Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The strangest thing about the prequel series is that one of the key points in the story is that the Galactic Republic uses an army of clones that fight against the Confederacy of Independent Systems. For some reason, we, the audience, are just expected to accept this fact, and the movie never really discusses this issue at all. I mean, there is plenty of pro-Republic propaganda that portrays the clones as the perfect soldier and everything, but the reality was, despite all of the genetic modifications the clones had, they were still pretty much human beings. Human beings who had no choice in what they could do in their own lives. They were essentially slaves. So today I want to really take a look at the average clone trooper and how they perceived the war and how that perception of the war, the Republic, changed as the war dragged on for a longer period of time. We'll be looking at a variety of milestones in the Clone Wars to kind of structure this video. We're all very different. We have different ways of responding to outside stimulus. We have different tolerances, pain thresholds, and we have different mentalities and ways of comprehending the events of the world that surrounds us. And a lot of this gets baked into you when you're really young. For instance, they say your personality is pretty much set by the time you leave first grade. Of course, part of your personality is affected by genetics. Part of it is caused by the environment you're raised in. When it came to the clone troopers, the Kaminoans fortunately had control of both. First, they heavily modified the clones at a genetic level. They took the Fett DNA with all of its terrific traits and tried to knock out the less desirable traits. They tried to make the Fett clones more docile and less independent in nature. Docile clones were more likely to control their emotions in the battlefield and think about their orders and mission. A cool and collected soldier is far superior to one that goes berserk and endangers everyone around him. The less independence alteration made the clones very community-oriented. This meant that they were dependent on their brothers and the clone army and the Republic. On top of that, the clones were given inhibitor chips to control them if anything went wrong. But we'll talk about that much later because the clones don't really know about this until the end of the war. The other change that the Kaminoans made was that the clones would age twice as fast as a normal human being. This would speed up the production process. And as the clones grew older, it would definitely affect them, especially when they were exposed to non-clones in the wider galaxy. There was just no way they couldn't compare themselves to other human beings they saw walking around free to live much longer lives. So these were basically the major genetic modifications that were made on the clones and what kind of separated them from other human beings. There wasn't really that much. The Kaminoans were perfect for this job of creating a large secret army. First, Kamino was hidden in a star system that very few people knew about. The Kaminoans also prided themselves in their ability to keep their clients anonymous if need be. Then there's the fact that a lot of Kaminoans were just complete psychopaths and saw the young clones they were creating as a product and not living beings. As a matter of fact, in Legends, it was said that the Kaminoans killed off a lot of their first few experimental batches of clones. A group of prototypes known as the Null class were threatened with termination when they were just a couple years old. The Kaminoans disliked the fact that they were pretty rebellious and weren't really good at following orders. Luckily, one of the Mandalorian trainers stepped in and saved the young boys from being turned into protein paste. From a psychologist's point of view, this would be a very traumatic event that happens very early in their child developmental stages, which would probably affect how their personality develops when they get older. Now, the Nulls would grow up to be excellent fighters, but most of them were pretty neurologically atypical. Now, the second and equally as important part of clone training was indoctrination. From a very young age, the Kaminoans used flash learning to rush the clones' education and have them ready for combat by the time they were 9 years old, and physically 18 years old. The clone troopers were constantly reminded about the Republic's great ideals and also goodness, and because they had no real experience with the Republic, they quickly adopted Republic patriotism as their belief system and became very ideological. And basically, the clones wouldn't really see any other people besides their trainers and other clones. Throughout their training, these clone brothers would all develop an extremely close bond. While this might not look like a stereotypical family, nature always finds its way, and a lot of these clones developed bonds that were closer than most people had with their own families. This could be due to the fact that they had no choice but to get along. You want to be able to trust your teammates during a live fire exercise. As a result, you had a clone army that was extremely well trained and disciplined and had over 9 years of instruction. The average soldier in any military here on Earth only receives a few weeks or months of basic training, and then maybe some further specialization. The clones were really obedient. They never complained on the job, they never resisted orders, and they didn't even have their own ideas, political or otherwise. But the one thing that they did understand was competence, or the lack of competence. It was something that the Kaminoans never really factored in. See, the clones spent so much of their time drilling and training that they were all perfectionists when it came to their craft. Although Republic propaganda did make the clones blindly worship and follow the Jedi, the Battle of Geonosis, the first real deployment of the clones, was a complete disaster. The Jedi commanders basically deployed the clones en masse and had them charge over several kilometers of flat desert land without any cover in an attempt to breach a heavily fortified and defended Separatist position. Thankfully, midway through the battlefield, a few Separatist warships crashed to the surface, killing probably thousands of clones, but also covering the entire battlefield with dust. With a bit of luck and the clones' superior training, they did manage to make it through the day with a win. But the casualties suffered were horrible. Over 100,000 clones were killed, wounded, or MIA out of 200,000. The clone commandos were affected even worse. Out of the 10,000 commanders deployed on the battlefield, only 50% made it back. This was seen as a huge waste amongst the commando community, who already had an altered form of FET DNA, which made them more aggressive and independent when compared to the basic clone trooper. These were heavily armed individuals who were put into four-man teams that were excellent at raiding and carrying out covert operations. But in this case, the Jedi generals treated them like infantry and sent them headfirst at an enemy position, completely wasting them. After Geonosis, the reality of what this war would be like hit a lot of the clones hard. Despite all their preparation, they couldn't really prepare for terrible leadership. Yet they fully understood the need to obey the chain of command. Without it, things would become chaotic. And despite what the Kaminoans thought, just Geonosis alone was enough to change the minds of many clones who now no longer wanted anything to do with the Republic. You had men like Sergeant Slick, a survivor of the Battle of Geonosis. He grew to hate the Jedi pretty quickly and saw them as completely incompetent military leaders. He believed that in order to save his fellow clones from death, he needed to kill the Jedi and end the war as soon as he could. He also realized that he and his fellow clones were indentured servants at best and at worst slaves. It doesn't take a genius to figure that part out, and although some clones will make excuses for the Republic or just straight out deny it, any rational individual could see that these clones were in fact slaves. The only things that was holding things together in the clone army was their loyalty to the Republic, but more importantly, their loyalty to one another. That was the one thing the Kaminoans did get right. Ultimately, guys like Sergeant Slick weren't even interested in money when they betrayed the Republic. Slick truly wanted to save his fellow brothers and also gain his own freedom. Despite all of the Kaminoans' planning and careful preparation, all of that genetic modification and conditioning fell apart as soon as the first clones hit a wall of blaster fire. By the end of the third year of the Clone Wars, which is where our Clone Wars history series is currently at, only 2/3 of the first generation clone troopers are still alive. Most of the clones left behind had seen close brothers die in their arms, and many also killed plenty of droids and maybe even sentient combatants. The thing is, death is not always easy for the brain to comprehend. It will try to adapt, of course. Humans are notoriously resilient when it comes to adapting to new environments and situations. Even situations where artillery shells are constantly falling on top of you and people are firing blaster bolts in an attempt to kill you. Of course, when an individual adapts to the battlefield, it's pretty hard for them to come back to normal everyday life. Now, the clones were probably genetically modified to be able to function in higher stress environments and keep their minds focused on the job. The statistics for PTSD don't exactly paint a clear picture, but we do know that certain individuals are resilient to getting this ailment. One of the most common triggers for PTSD in Americans are car accidents, yet not every American who has survived a car accident has symptoms. So this could be a genetic thing, but at the same time, there also is a correlation between childhood trauma and then getting PTSD later in their adult life. I imagine some of the Null class clones became traumatized over the fact that they almost got turned into protein paste by the Kaminoan scientists. It's definitely not good for childhood development and probably would affect how they reacted to non-stop combat as clones. And this was kind of one of the major issues, of course, with the clone troopers. They were pretty much outnumbered the entire war by the Separatist droids. And there were very few non-clone combatants fighting the war, and they mostly fought in planetary defense forces and local security forces. So the clones basically had to be on the front lines at all time, which would have greatly increased the risk of ailments like PTSD. And then without family to visit and friends to see, the clones were also given very little R&R, if any. Some of the more special clones, like the Gnolls, were rumored to be put on ice in between missions to make sure that they didn't age too much in between battles. I don't care how tough and badass you are, but if you have to spend every waking moment of your life fighting and killing people, that is going to mess you up emotionally and mentally. Of course, not all clones went this route. Some clones saw a way out of the military and just took it. Like Cutler Quain. Everyone he knew was killed when his transport was shot down by a Seppi gunship shortly after the Battle of Geonosis. The planet he was on was called Selakamai, and it was relatively peaceful and undisturbed during the war. He ended up settling down with a very wholesome Twi'lek broad and her kids. He found true happiness living the simple life of a farmer. And when he came into contact with clones like Captain Rex, who was steadfast in his loyalty to the Republic still, it was interesting to see their different views on being clones clash. Cutler Quain had found a new family after his old one had disappeared. Which shows us again, despite all of the conditioning and modifications that the Kaminoans made, all of these clones still had very human desires. Clones like Cutler Quain valued their connection with other human beings, even if they happened to have tentacles on their heads. This moment probably shook up Captain Rex more than he lets on. In the 7th final season of the Clone Wars, we hear Rex talk about the complexities of their situation. While a lot of these clones might have hated the war, especially after losing so many of their loved ones, clones like Rex also acknowledged that they would have never been created without the war. They were stuck in a pretty difficult situation, and they really had no advocates outside of the clone army that could stand up for them. The inhibitor chips that we mentioned before were placed inside the clones to assure that Order 66 would be carried out flawlessly. Although the clone who uncovered the conspiracy of the chips died after he was goaded into attacking the Emperor, many other clones, including Rex, would spread his message and independently research whether what he was saying was true. Although the clones weren't sure who implanted the chip, it was a huge breach in trust, if any of them even remotely suspected that the Republic was behind this. The clones mostly accepted their role as soldiers for the Republic, but they saw themselves as human beings, and they wanted others to see them as human beings and not as robots. 4 years of war, the loss of many of their friends, the realization that there was a wider world out there for them to experience, caused many clones to doubt their lives. And although the majority of the clones stayed on when the clones became stormtroopers, many also found their way towards freedom. A lot of clones started realizing as they grew older and suffered more physical ailments that although they were perfectly designed for war, no one actually thought of an exit strategy for them after they retired, or if they could retire. Rumors that clones were being put down because of injuries that would no longer allow them to fight spread through the rank as urban legends and severely hurt morale. You see, the clones were constantly being underestimated by the individuals who had created them and were ordering them around. And for some reason, the Republic, with all of its lofty ideas and progressive values, failed to see that they were essentially creating slaves to fight their wars for them. This is probably one of the more messed up things that the Jedi Order and Galactic Republic endorsed, and it's kind of fitting that they both disappeared by the end of the Clone Wars. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.